My name is Natalie Quinn. I'm 32 years old, and until last winter, I thought I had finally figured out how to balance being the quiet achiever in a loud family. I had a good job, a calm apartment, a circle of friends who genuinely cared about me, and I had learned not to expect too much from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I thought I had made peace with being the background character in my own family's story. That is, until the holidays rolled around and I got left off the guest list. And then, 3 days after Christmas, I received something I never could have imagined. An official invoice from my parents, asking me to pay nearly $8,000 for my younger brother's career development trip to Europe. That's when everything broke open. That's when I stopped keeping the peace and started reclaiming my place, not just in the family, but in my own life. Before I go further, I'd love to know, have you ever felt like the outsider in your own family? Like no matter what you do, someone else always comes first. If so, you're not alone. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe if stories about family, self-worth, and standing up for yourself resonate with you. What I'm about to share isn't just my story. It might be yours too. I grew up in Salem Heights, a leafy suburb about 25 minutes outside Portland, Oregon. Our house sat on a cul-de-sac lined with maple trees and porch swings. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family that had it all. Dad ran a real estate agency with his name on the signs all over town, and Mom stayed home after my little brother, Brandon, was born. We had a dog named Mocha, 2 cars in the garage, and a backyard big enough for 4th of July barbecues and makeshift soccer games. On paper, we looked like a postcard. Inside, there were patterns no one talked about, and I learned early that being the dependable one came with both praise and distance. Brandon was 3 years younger than me and the center of everything. He was funny in that way that made adults laugh harder than the joke deserved. He had big brown eyes and a crooked smile, and he knew how to use them. I was the straight-A student, the rule follower, the kid who colored between the lines and cleaned up other people's messes. And that became my job forever. When I turned 16, I had saved up $2,800 from babysitting and working at the local smoothie bar. I asked my parents if they could help me get a used car so I wouldn't have to take the bus to school and work. They said if I maintained a perfect GPA, they'd match half. I did. I ended up with a 7-year-old Ford Focus with over 100,000 miles on it, and I was proud. 6 months later, Brandon turned 16. Dad showed up in the driveway with a leased Toyota 4Runner, complete with Bluetooth and leather seats. It had a red bow on the hood. "He needs to build confidence," Mom said when I stood there speechless. "You've always been so independent, Nat. That's your gift." That was the line I'd hear again and again. You're independent. You're the strong one. It was never a choice, it was a necessity. When it came time for college, I was accepted into UCLA with partial scholarship. It was my dream, but expensive. My parents said they could help with $9,000 a year. "The rest," Dad said, "will build character." I took out loans, applied for grants, worked weekends, and graduated with $91,000 in student debt. I entered the workforce tired but determined. I took an entry-level role at a sustainability marketing firm in Seattle and slowly climbed my way up. At 29, I became one of the youngest division leads in the company's history. My apartment was modest, my furniture secondhand, but everything in it was earned. Brandon, on the other hand, went to an arts program in New York City. His tuition was paid in full. My parents covered his housing too, a 2-bedroom loft in Soho that cost more than my annual salary at the time. When he switched majors twice and dropped 2 internships, it was chalked up to creative growth. When I got promoted, Mom asked if that meant I'd have less time for dating. That's how it always was. Still, I called every week. I remembered anniversaries. I flew home for Thanksgiving and Christmas. I brought thoughtful gifts and smiled through long dinners where Brandon talked about his photography exhibitions and short films, and I listened like a good sister. I tried to show up. I tried to be enough. Last fall, I was offered a regional director role, huge promotion, massive step up. I was over the moon. I called my mom as soon as I left the HR office. She sounded distracted. "That's great, sweetie. Did I tell you Brandon's dating a woman whose aunt owns a gallery in Prague? She could open so many doors for him." That was the last thing she said before she hung up. No one in my family acknowledged the promotion after that. In early December, my mom called. That alone was odd. I'm usually the one reaching out. "Hi, honey, about Christmas this year, it's going to be a little different." My heart sank. She went on about some minor kitchen remodel and how it might be cramped this year. "Brandon's bringing Lena, and your dad doesn't do well with too many people during the holidays. We just thought maybe it'd be best to keep it simple this time." I said I could sleep on the couch if space was the issue. She brushed that off. "You understand, right? You've always been good at understanding." That was my role, after all. The one who adjusted, the one who made space for others. I said I understood, then hung up and sat in silence for what felt like an hour. I told myself it was fine, that I'd make other plans, that it was just a fluke. But deep down, I knew better. Christmas came and went. I spent it with my boyfriend Evan and his sister's family, watching holiday movies and helping make lasagna from a passed-down recipe. It was warm and real. I laughed with his nieces, helped wrap presents, and tried to focus on what I had, not what I lacked. Still, every night that week, I checked my mom's Instagram. The remodel? Non-existent. The house looked pristine. Brandon and Lena posed with glasses of wine in front of the fireplace. There were 4 stockings hung on the mantel: Mom, Dad, Brandon, and Lena. Mine wasn't there. The one with my name embroidered in gold thread from when I was 6, it was gone. Or maybe it had never mattered. 3 days later, an email landed in my inbox. The subject: Q4 Family Reconciliation. It was from my dad. Inside was a PDF invoice, labeled as if from a law firm, with breakdowns like Brandon Quinn, International Photography Expedition, Lena Reeves, Creative Consulting Travel, Equipment Rental and Upgrades. Total, $7,980. My name was listed under Remittance Contact. There was a bank account listed for wire transfer. And a note: "As you're now in an advanced leadership role, we expect you to contribute proportionally to family growth. Payment expected by Jan 15. Late fees apply." I didn't even blink at first. I stared, then reread it, then laughed out loud. My parents had excluded me from Christmas, hadn't acknowledged a single milestone of mine all year, and now they were billing me for my brother's vacation with his girlfriend. It wasn't even the money, it was the assumption, the expectation that I would keep funding the machine that left me out, that I would be the adult in the room, the blank check, the safety net. Again. I didn't know it then, but that invoice would become the turning point of my entire life. Not because of what they asked for, but because, for the first time in my adult life, I finally said no. I sat there staring at the invoice on my laptop screen like it was a message from another dimension. It wasn't just the absurdity of the amount or the fact that my name had been placed under Remittance Contact like I was some corporate sponsor for a startup I never believed in. It was the audacity, the cruel absurdity of asking for money after disinviting me from the holiday that I had shown up for every year, even when it meant flying through snowstorms or canceling plans with people who actually wanted me around. I read the email again, looking for signs of irony or even some veiled humor. There was none. Just my dad's signature block and a crisp, accountant-style closing line, as if this was all standard family practice. That afternoon, I couldn't focus on anything. Evan noticed I was unusually quiet over dinner, and when he asked, I slid my phone across the table with the email pulled up. He blinked twice. "Is this a joke?" I shook my head. "I wish." He read it all the way through again. "Wait, they didn't invite you to Christmas, and now they're billing you for your brother's trip?" I nodded. "Apparently because I'm in a leadership position now, and they consider that a justification." He leaned back, rubbing his forehead. "Natalie, this isn't favoritism anymore. This is exploitation." That word hit me like a slap. Exploitation. It wasn't new, but no one had ever named it before. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, scrolling through years of texts and emails from my parents. Patterns emerged, old requests like, "Can you transfer $200 to help Brandon fix his car? We're a little strapped this month," sent while they were on vacation in Napa. Or, "Your brother is feeling down. Could you call and cheer him up?" Sent the morning I was having minor surgery. The more I looked, the clearer it became. I wasn't their daughter. I was their emergency fund, their tech support, their emotional insurance policy. I was the default adult, the fallback plan, the reliable one, always the giver, never the chosen. I pulled up an old family photo from Christmas 5 years ago. Brandon sat in the center surrounded by unwrapped gifts, designer sneakers, noise-canceling headphones, a drone, while I held up a journal and a mug with my name on it. My smile in that picture was tight, the kind that hides disappointment so well it almost passes for joy. By morning, my exhaustion had turned into focus. I took a personal day from work and scheduled an emergency session with my therapist, Dr. Harlow. After hearing the entire story, she didn't hesitate. What you're describing is textbook golden child and scapegoat family dynamics. It's emotionally abusive, it's systemic, and it's not your fault. Her words steadied me. I asked what I should do. She leaned forward gently. That depends on what you want. If you pay the invoice, the pattern continues. If you don't, it may rupture the relationship. But Natalie, do you even have the relationship you think you have? That question sat in my chest like a stone. I'd spent years clinging to scraps, convincing myself that crumbs were enough. But what if they never were? What if the love I thought I was preserving was just obligation disguised as affection? I walked out of her office and into the cold January air with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. That night, I remembered something from college. I had been added as an authorized user on my parents' credit cards during freshman year, just in case. I hadn't used them in over a decade, but I never asked to be removed. Out of curiosity, I logged into one of the old portals. My name was still there, authorized on 3 different accounts. A switch flipped in my brain, not revenge, not spite, but sovereignty. I wasn't going to use their cards. I wasn't going to do anything unethical. But I would remove myself. Because if they had no problem billing me for Brandon's vacation, I had no problem severing my financial entanglement with them. The next morning, I called each credit card company and removed my name. One by one, 3 different reps asked, "Are you sure? This could impact your credit history." I said yes. I wanted to stand alone, and I meant it. That night, I started drafting my response to the invoice. I wrote version after version. One was dripping in sarcasm, another read like a resignation letter. One sounded too angry, another too polite. Nothing fit. Evan found me at the kitchen counter surrounded by balled-up paper. He handed me a glass of wine and asked, "What if your response isn't a letter? What if it's an action?" That idea took root instantly. The next day, I opened a fresh document and created a spreadsheet. 2 columns, one for me, one for Brandon. I tracked everything I could remember over the past 20 years: tuition support, housing, gifts, major life expenses. The result was staggering. They had spent over $300,000 more on him. I wasn't bitter, I was validated. The facts were right there, undeniable. The next week, in my second therapy session, I read that number out loud. Dr. Harlow nodded slowly. "Now you have the truth. The question is, what do you want to do with it?" I didn't want an apology I'd never believe. I didn't want revenge that would poison my peace. I wanted boundaries. I wanted the old roles to end, even if the relationship ended with them. I wanted dignity, so I printed a $1 bill, taped it inside a blank winter-themed card. Wrote 7 words. "Santa skipped me too, Merry Christmas anyway." Then I folded my spreadsheet, my invoice, and my own short, clear note. "Attached is your original request and my response. No payment will be made. This pattern ends now." I mailed it certified, not to be petty but to ensure it couldn't be ignored. As I dropped it into the blue box outside the post office, I felt something loosen inside me. Something old, something tight, and something new rushed in to replace it. Stillness, strength, a quiet flame of self-worth I had nearly extinguished trying to earn what should have been mine from the start. 27 hours after delivery confirmation, my phone began vibrating nonstop. First came texts from my dad. "This is not acceptable. Call me immediately." Then, "Explain yourself." Then, "This is childish and vindictive." Voicemails followed, his voice rising with each message. "Your mother is in tears. If this is about the invoice, we can discuss payment terms." Then came my mom's message, a single voicemail, tearful and gasping. "Why are you doing this to us, after everything we've done for you?" That phrase stuck in my chest like splinters. Everything they'd done for me, like I was ungrateful, like I hadn't been the one giving all along. Then Brandon texted. "Wow, Way to ruin everything, Nat. Mom's crying nonstop. Not everyone gets a cushy job. Maybe they help me more because I actually show up. The revisionist history began instantly. I became the villain, the ungrateful daughter, the selfish sister, the one who couldn't let her brother have one nice thing. I didn't reply. I forwarded the messages to Dr. Harlow and silenced my notifications. For the first time in my life, I didn't engage. I didn't explain. I didn't shrink. The silence was electric. I didn't reply. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I let the texts pile up like snowdrifts outside a locked door. Each message, each missed call was a reminder that I had finally done the unthinkable in my family. I had broken character. I wasn't the fixer, the diplomat, the first to fold in the name of peace. I had stepped out of the role they wrote for me without their permission, and they didn't know what to do with that. But silence didn't mean numbness. Inside, everything was roaring. My chest buzzed with anxiety so sharp it felt electric. I spent most of that day walking the perimeter of my apartment like a trapped animal, replaying every voicemail in my head. My father's indignation, my mother's guilt-laced weeping, Brandon's entitlement. It was all so familiar, and that's what made it dangerous. Familiarity makes dysfunction feel safe, and I was done feeling safe in a story that kept me small. By evening, the tension was unbearable. I lit candles, I made tea. None of it helped. I could feel the confrontation rising in my throat like steam. Not to lash out, not to destroy, but to finally speak plainly. Not through letters or spreadsheets or silent exits, but with my own voice unshaking. So when my parents called again at 7:46 p.m., I answered. "Natalie," my father began, his voice already wound tight. "This has gone far enough. We expect an explanation. That card you sent, was that supposed to be funny? Because no one's laughing here." I didn't speak. I let the silence land like a stone. My mother's voice broke through next. "Sweetheart, we don't understand why you're being so cold. We've done everything we could for you, and this feels cruel." "Cruel?" I said quietly. "Do you want to talk about cruel? Let's start with the Christmas invitation I never got. Let's talk about how you excluded me and then sent me an invoice for Brandon's ski trip like I'm your bank account with a birth certificate." My father exhaled hard. "That's not what this is. You've done well for yourself. We thought it was time you contributed." "Contributed?" I interrupted, my voice sharp now. "You think I haven't contributed? I paid for my own college. I've been financially independent since I was 21. I've helped Brandon, helped you, sent money, fixed problems. And I've never once been treated like my needs matter. Never once. They tried to jump in, tried to redirect, but I didn't let them. You say Brandon needs more support because he's finding himself. But what about me? What support did I get when I was working 3 jobs and still skipping meals to make rent?" "That was your choice," my dad said flatly. "You're capable, you never asked for help." "Because I learned early that asking wouldn't get me anywhere," I snapped. "Because every time I needed something, it was inconvenient. But when Brandon needed something, you moved heaven and earth. And now you're angry because I won't help fund the latest chapter of his European soul-searching." My mother tried her old tone, gentle, slightly patronizing. "Honey, Brandon's an artist. You have a stable career. You're not struggling." I let that sit for a second before answering. "That's right. I built that stability without your help, and I'm proud of that. But don't use my independence as an excuse to keep taking from me. I'm not your safety net. I'm not your extra credit child." "We just want the family to stay close," she added weakly. "Then you should have invited me to Christmas," I said. "You should have treated me like a daughter, not a resource." The line went quiet for a long moment, then my dad cleared his throat. "Look, if this is about the money, maybe we can forget the invoice. But this attitude of yours, this distance, you need to check that." "I don't think you understand," I said, calmly now, almost tired. "It's not about forgetting the invoice. It's about what that invoice represented. It was the moment I realized I wasn't angry because of just one thing. I was angry because of everything. Because of the years, I played the role of the strong one while watching you bend over backwards for him. Because of how you made me feel like loving me was optional." We ended the call not with a solution, but with an acknowledgement. The house of cards had finally collapsed. I didn't cry after. I didn't scream. I just sat in my dark living room, watching the city lights blink like signals from some better world. I knew things might never go back to what they were. But for the first time, I also knew I didn't want them to. The next day, Brandon called. That alone was shocking. He rarely reached out first. "So," he began, his voice hesitant, "I heard about the situation." "You mean the invoice," I said. "The one I wasn't going to pay." He sighed. "I didn't know they sent that, I swear. I would have said something." "Would you?" I asked. He was silent. Then, "Maybe not, I don't know. I'm used to them doing stuff like that." "That's part of the problem," I said. "You've gotten so used to being prioritized that you don't even notice it anymore." "That's not fair," he shot back. "I didn't ask to be the favorite. And I didn't ask to be invisible," I said. "But here we are." He was quiet for a long beat. Then, in a softer tone, "I don't hate you, you know." "I don't hate you either," I replied. "But I need things to change." "I don't even know how to change," he said, almost a whisper. "I've always been them, their mirror, their project." "Then start by being something else," I said. "Start by seeing the rest of us." It wasn't a perfect conversation. There were no apologies, no grand revelations. But it was real. And that, after years of curated holiday cards and forced smiles, was more valuable than anything they had ever given me. As I hung up the phone, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded, rooted in my own truth for once. The kind of truth that doesn't need to scream to be heard. The kind that simply stands. After the call with Brandon, I didn't feel victorious. I felt emptied and awake. Like something old had finally exhaled inside of me. There was no yelling, no slamming of doors, no declaration of independence. Just the quiet, powerful relief of finally saying what needed to be said, out loud, to someone who had never really heard it before. That night, I took a walk alone through my neighborhood. The streets were wet from an early evening rain, and Christmas lights still flickered across porches like ghosts refusing to let go. I passed familiar houses with golden windows, families watching TV, laughing, sitting down to dinner. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was missing something. I wasn't on the outside looking in. I was simply walking away. In the days that followed, the calls slowed, the texts faded, and the silence returned, not the painful kind, but the kind that felt clean, like fresh air after a storm. I went back to work and threw myself into my role with more clarity than I'd had in months. My team noticed it before I did. I was sharper in meetings, bolder in pitches, more grounded in my own voice. I stopped second-guessing myself before speaking. I started standing differently, walking differently. Evan noticed too. One night over dinner, he looked at me across the table and said, "You've changed." I smiled. "I think I'm finally taking up space." He reached across and squeezed my hand. "I always knew you could. I'm just glad you finally believe it." The more I moved forward, the more the past started to lose its grip on me. But there were still questions I couldn't shake. Not about them, about me. Why had I stayed in that dynamic so long? Why had I normalized being overlooked? I scheduled another session with Dr. Harlow, needing to go deeper. I told her about the spreadsheet, the receipts, the birthday gifts that didn't match, the time they asked me to wire Brandon money on the day of my own promotion. She listened carefully, then said, "Natalie, what you're describing isn't just inequality. It's conditioning. You were trained to believe that love had to be earned, that if you were useful enough, quiet enough, they'd choose you eventually." Her words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. "But that's the lie," she continued. "Love doesn't need justification. It doesn't ask you to prove your worth. What you grew up with wasn't love. It was expectation disguised as affection." That truth cracked something open in me. Not bitterness, not anger, just grief. Grief for the girl I used to be. The one who thought if she got high enough grades or brought the best gifts or made everyone else comfortable, she'd finally be seen. That night, I sat on my bed with old photo albums spread out across the quilt. I looked at every Christmas morning, every graduation, every family dinner. In almost every photo, Brandon was front and center, arms around both parents, laughing, glowing, and me slightly off to the side, smiling with her mouth, not her eyes, always neat, always helpful, always almost included. I picked up a photo from the year I turned 21. I was wearing a blazer I bought with my own money, holding a cake I had baked for Brandon's birthday. He was grinning in the background, opening a gift from my parents, a new laptop. That year, they gave me a $25 Target gift card for my birthday and said, "You're so easy to shop for. You already have everything." I didn't cry. I didn't even frown. I had smiled and said thank you. And I had meant it. Because back then, I still believed that if I was grateful enough, they'd finally give me what I needed. But I didn't believe that anymore. The following week, I gave a presentation at the Regional Directors Summit, an audience of 75, including C-suite leadership. I walked on stage in a black suit I bought with my first bonus, clicked to my first slide, and spoke with a calm I didn't know I possessed. When it was over, people clapped. Some stood. And for once, I didn't shrink from the praise. I didn't think about whether my mom would downplay it or if Brandon would find a way to center himself in my story. I let the applause in. That night, Evan and I stayed up late talking. I told him everything about the spreadsheet, the photos, the therapy. He listened with the kind of focus that doesn't ask for resolution, only truth. Then he said, "You know what I think? I think you're finally parenting yourself, the way they never did." That landed in my bones because he was right. For the first time, I was nurturing my own needs instead of abandoning them for someone else's comfort. I was showing up for myself the way I had always shown up for them. I started a journal. I wrote down every time I made a decision that centered my well-being. I wrote down every time I said no without guilt. Every time I said yes to something that was only for me. And slowly, a new pattern emerged. Not one based on guilt or duty, but on value. I even began working with a financial coach to help other women in similar situations, those who had been the reliable daughters, the background siblings, the ones who were told, "You're just better at handling things." We created a small workshop in Seattle for women navigating financial boundaries with family. The first session filled up in a day. Dozens of women, each with a story like mine, sat in a circle and shared their versions of being the strong one. It was the first time I felt like I belonged without having to earn it. At the end of the session, one woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Hearing you talk about that invoice made me realize I've been emotionally invoiced by my family for years. I just never saw the paperwork." I hugged her. Sometimes the paperwork shows up in words, sometimes in silence. Either way, it's real. A few weeks later, my parents invited me to their wedding anniversary dinner. I hesitated. I didn't know if I was ready, but something in me was curious, so I went. When I arrived, I noticed small changes. The living room had been rearranged, less formal, more lived in. There were new family photos on the mantel, and this time I was in them, not all, but some. My mother looked at me from across the room. "We realized there weren't enough pictures of you, so we fixed that." I nodded. I didn't thank her. It wasn't gratitude I felt, it was recognition, and that was enough. Dinner was awkward but civil. Brandon was quieter. He asked about my new workshop. My father even said, "I saw your name in the industry newsletter. Impressive work." I nodded again, small steps. After dessert, my mother pulled me aside and said softly, "I'm sorry, Nat, I really am. We didn't realize how much we were hurting you. We were just used to the pattern." "Used to it," I repeated. "Not the same as right." "I know," she said, "but we're trying." I didn't say it was okay, I just said, "Good." Then my father handed me an envelope as I walked to the door. "Don't open it now," he said. I didn't trust it, but I took it. In the car, I opened it under the dome light. Inside was a check, made out to me, for exactly $7,980, the full amount of the invoice I had refused to pay. No note. Just the check. I stared at it for a long time. Then I folded it carefully and tucked it into my glove box. I never cashed it. Later that week, I framed it and hung it on the wall in my home office. Not as a trophy, not as revenge, but as a reminder. That was the moment I stopped being their backup plan and started being my own first choice. I looked at the check again the next morning, still resting where I'd left it in the glove compartment. The pale blue paper, the neat handwriting, the exact number that had nearly cracked my identity in half just months before, $7,980. It was surreal. A 6 by 3 inch admission that something had been wrong, even if no one said the words aloud. I didn't need the money. I needed what it represented, acknowledgement. Not love, not a fix, just the quiet admission that they had gone too far. And maybe, for once, they knew it. I didn't frame the check because it meant we were healed. I framed it because it proved I wasn't crazy for feeling what I felt. After the dinner, things didn't magically transform. There was no fairy tale redemption, no epiphany that turned my parents into new people. But something had shifted. Subtly, awkwardly, but undeniably. The silence that used to hover between us after each call became shorter. My father, always the authority in the room, started asking questions instead of just declaring things. "How's the campaign going?" he'd ask. "Do you enjoy managing people?" And to my shock, he actually listened to the answers. My mother called once a week now, not to guilt me into calling her, but to check in. She told me about her new book club. She asked what kind of tea I liked. She even asked for my workshop schedule, something she would have once called too niche or a phase. It was like we had all stepped into a new language, one where nobody was fluent yet, but everyone was trying. Brandon, surprisingly, changed the most. He started texting just to say hi. Sometimes he'd send me photos of his work, not for validation but to share. He got a part-time job at a photo lab downtown, not glamorous but steady. He paid his own rent for the first time. I didn't praise him like a parent. I didn't gush. I just said, "Proud of you." And it felt like the right thing to say. During one of our now regular phone calls, he admitted, "I think I missed out by always being the favorite. I never had to build anything myself. I never had to prove anything. You had to learn all of that the hard way. You're stronger than me." I laughed. Not stronger, just seasoned. But inside, a small knot of resentment untied itself. Maybe he wasn't my enemy. Maybe he'd just been lost in a different kind of fog. By April, I was leading a national campaign for an eco-brand trying to pivot into mainstream retail. It was high stakes, high pressure, and everything I'd ever wanted. And I handled it with clarity I never had before. I wasn't afraid to take up space anymore. I wasn't nervous to disagree with someone in the room. I knew my value now, not because someone handed it to me, but because I fought for it. Evan saw it too. One morning over coffee, he said, "It's like you finally stopped editing yourself. You walk like someone who knows she deserves the whole seat, not just the edge." That night, while we were away in Leavenworth for a weekend hike and wine tour, he proposed. Not with a big speech or fireworks, just a quiet, steady question in the middle of a vineyard at sunset. "Will you build your life with me, fully, without apology?" And I said yes, without hesitation, without fear. Because I had already started building that life, inside myself. He was just asking to join me in it. The news of our engagement spread quickly. My parents were shocked, but genuinely happy. My mom even asked, "Would you want to use the backyard for a small ceremony?" I told her honestly that we hadn't decided yet, that we were doing things differently. She nodded, almost relieved. "I understand." And she did. That was the new language. Respect instead of assumption. The women's workshop I co-founded kept growing. Word spread, and we had a wait list for 3 months out. We started talking to nonprofits about collaboration. People wrote in from other states, asking when we'd host virtual sessions. I wasn't just healing. I was helping others find language for their own silent suffering. One woman, after a session, said to me, "You gave me permission to say no to a family that only called when they needed something." I thought saying no meant I was selfish, but maybe it just means I'm finally loving myself back. I knew that feeling. I had lived it. July arrived faster than expected. My parents hosted a dinner for their wedding anniversary, and this time, the invitation was clear, direct, and addressed only to me. No assumptions, no expectations. I walked into their house for the first time since the Christmas that never was. The house looked the same, but it felt different. The tension had thinned, the air less heavy. The dining table had 6 chairs, not 4. My stocking was back over the fireplace, not as a peace offering, but as a quiet correction. During dinner, my father asked Brandon to show us his latest photos. After he shared, he turned to me and said, "And Nat, what's the new campaign you're leading?" Everyone listened. Even Lena, Brandon's partner, complimented my strategy. My mother made my favorite lemon pie. My name was spelled correctly on the place card. After the meal, my mom pulled me into the hallway as the others cleaned up. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice lower than usual. "That Christmas, the one we left you out of, I've replayed it over and over. I was wrong. We were wrong. I don't know how we didn't see it." She took a breath. "We chose easy. You were always so capable, and Brandon always needed more, so we kept giving. But easy isn't the same as fair, and it wasn't love, not the way you deserved." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry." I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let the words echo, then I nodded. "Thank you for saying that. It wasn't everything, but it was something I never thought I'd hear." When I left that evening, my father walked me to the door and said, "I know I don't say it well, but I'm proud of who you are. You're formidable." I smiled. "Took you long enough." He laughed, and for once it didn't feel loaded. I drove home with the window down, the wind threading through my hair. I didn't feel redeemed or restored. I felt real. Not because they finally saw me, but because I stopped needing them too. The girl who sent holiday cards and hoped for thank you texts, who edited her own worth to fit a dinner table, she wasn't gone. She had just outgrown that seat. Back home, I passed by the framed check one more time. I didn't need to read it anymore. It wasn't about the money. It never was. That check didn't represent compensation, it represented reclamation. My story wasn't about revenge. It was about return. Returning to myself. Returning to the truth that had always been waiting for me. I am not responsible for anyone else's comfort if it comes at the cost of my dignity. I don't owe silence to stay connected. I don't owe compliance to be loved. I don't owe invoices to be called family. 6 months after the invoice, my life didn't just look different, it felt different. It wasn't a sudden transformation. It was a slow, deliberate reconstruction of who I was without the weight of needing to be chosen. The patterns that used to control me didn't disappear overnight, but they lost their power each time I stood my ground, each time I refused to shrink back into the role that had been written for me. My family dynamic didn't turn into a Hallmark movie. There were still awkward moments, slips into old habits, and subtle expectations they weren't even aware they carried. But the difference now was that I could see it clearly, and I could name it when it happened. Sometimes my mom would get overly excited about Brandon's work and talk about his photography for 10 straight minutes before asking about my job. I would gently say, "I love hearing about him, but I'd appreciate the same space to share what I'm working on." Sometimes she responded with grace. Sometimes she got defensive, but either way, I said it. And that changed everything. My father still found vulnerability uncomfortable. He'd rather send a text than say something in person. But last month, after one of my campaigns got featured in a national magazine, he sent me a card. A real one. Inside it said, "That article made me proud, but not as proud as watching you stand up for yourself." That one's on my fridge. Brandon kept evolving. The invoice that was meant to make me small became the receipt for my freedom. I didn't owe them money. I didn't owe them silence. I didn't owe them a version of me that fit neatly into the shadows. And neither do you. You are not here to carry generations of unspoken expectations. You are not selfish for needing respect. You are not wrong for wanting reciprocity. You are not broken because you want more than crumbs from people who claim to love you. If you've ever found yourself standing at the edge of a family gathering wondering, "Do they even see me?" You're not alone. If you've ever received an unspoken invoice in the form of guilt, silence, or conditional love, I see you. And if this story resonated with you, or made you think of someone who needs to hear it, please share it with them. Leave a comment below if you've ever had to reclaim your worth from the people closest to you. I read every story, and I promise your voice matters. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so we can keep building this community together. Because your worth isn't up for negotiation. Not in your job, not in your friendships, and definitely not in your family. You deserve to be seen, not for what you do, but for who you are. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for letting me take up space